John had worked at the company for over 10 years. Every day, he arrived early and left late, doing his job as quietly and efficiently as possible. He wasn't the kind of person to complain or ask for recognition. He simply took care of the building, sweeping the floors, emptying trash bins, cleaning windows, whatever needed to be done. The company didn't know much about him, and John liked it that way. He preferred to keep to himself. But today, everything would change. It was another busy morning in the office. The hum of computers, the clicking of keyboards, and the chatter of employees filled the air. The CEO, Mr. Anderson, sat in his glass office at the top floor, overlooking the city with a cold, indifferent look. Mr. Anderson was known for being a hard man, with little patience for anything he considered unimportant. And to him, the janitors were unimportant. John pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, quietly passing the busy office workers. He knew his job wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. The noise of phones ringing and people talking didn't bother him. He had grown used to the rhythm of the office. Today, however, things felt different. There was tension in the air, though John couldn't quite place why. John reached the restroom on the second floor and began his usual routine of cleaning. It wasn't until he was nearly finished that he heard footsteps approaching. He didn't pay much attention at first, assuming it was just another employee. But when the door swung open, he turned to see the figure of Mr. Anderson, the CEO, standing in the doorway. "Are you the one who left the mop in the hallway this morning?" Mr. Anderson's voice was sharp, like a whip cracking in the air. John stood up straight, surprised by the sudden confrontation. "I'm sorry, sir. I must have left it there when I was cleaning. I'll take care of it right away." But Mr. Anderson didn't seem to care about the apology. His cold eyes narrowed, and he walked into the restroom without a word. He looked around briefly, as if inspecting every corner. John felt the pressure building. Something wasn't right. "I don't have time for this," Mr. Anderson said, turning back toward the door. "I'm firing you." John blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Firing me, sir, for a mop?" "Yes," Mr. Anderson replied, his tone flat and dismissive. "You're clearly not paying attention to your job. I don't have time for mistakes. I want you out of here by the end of the day. Now clean up that mess in the hallway and leave. Your services are no longer required." John's face remained calm, but his heart was racing. He had worked at the company for so long, and now he was being fired over something as small as a mop left in the wrong place. His mind raced, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded. "Understood, sir," he said quietly, gathering his cleaning supplies. As Mr. Anderson left the restroom, John's hands trembled slightly. He had always known the CEO was arrogant, but this was something else. To fire him without a second thought, to treat him like he was nothing, it felt like a slap in the face. But John didn't say a word. He finished cleaning the restroom in silence and walked out into the hallway. The mop was still where he had left it, in the spot that had earned him the CEO's wrath. He bent down, picked it up, and moved it to a corner. As he stood there, staring at the mop in his hands, something inside him snapped. He didn't understand what had just happened. But he knew one thing: this wasn't the end. This wasn't how his story would end. John walked to the elevator in the lobby, his face still as calm as ever. He passed by the reception desk, where the receptionist gave him a quick, polite nod. No one knew who John really was. To them, he was just the janitor, just another nameless face doing the dirty work. But today, something had changed. John wasn't just a janitor anymore. The company would soon find out just how wrong they were about him. He stepped into the elevator, the doors closing behind him. As the elevator descended, John's mind went back to his past. The years he spent in the military, the places he had been, the missions he had completed. He had learned to handle pressure, to control his emotions, and to stay calm no matter what the situation was. But this was different. This wasn't a mission. This was personal. The elevator came to a stop, and the doors opened to the lobby. John walked out, his head held high. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was certain of one thing. Mr. Anderson would regret this day, and John would make sure of it. John walked out of the building, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The cold air hit his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk, but it didn't faze him. He had been through much worse. He didn't feel anger or frustration. He felt calm. Too calm, maybe. His footsteps echoed in the empty street as he walked to the small diner a few blocks away. It was the same place he went to every morning before work. The waitress, an older woman named Mary, always smiled at him and brought him the same cup of coffee. She had no idea who he was or what he had done. To her, he was just a quiet man who sat in the corner booth, sipping his coffee in peace. But today, he wasn't thinking about coffee. His mind was somewhere else. As John sat down at the booth, the waitress placed the coffee in front of him. She didn't ask him anything. She knew he wasn't in the mood for small talk. He nodded his thanks and took a slow sip, feeling the warmth of the drink as it spread through him. He looked out the window, lost in thought. The world outside seemed normal, people going about their lives, not knowing what had just happened to him. No one knew that the man they saw walking down the street was much more than just a janitor. John's thoughts drifted to his past, back to the days when he was known by another name. The name he had long since left behind. A name that had once been feared and respected. A different life. Years ago, John had been part of something bigger, much bigger than cleaning floors. He had been a soldier, a special forces operative, one of the best in his field. He had served in dangerous places, completed impossible missions, and fought in wars most people would never know about. He had learned skills that went beyond anything anyone could imagine. But none of that mattered now. It was all behind him. His military career had been intense. The training, the operations, the constant danger, it had shaped him into someone else. Someone strong, someone who could handle almost anything. But it also took its toll. The memories of the battles he fought in haunted him. The people he lost, the things he had seen. Sometimes it felt like they would never leave him. He had left that life behind when he chose to settle down and live a quieter life. He had wanted peace, a simple job, a simple life. But now, it seemed like that life was slipping through his fingers. John didn't regret leaving the military. He had found a sense of calm working as a janitor. It was a job where no one bothered him, and no one knew who he really was. It gave him a chance to live anonymously, far away from the noise of his past. But now, with his firing from the company, something inside him was waking up again. The calmness, the peace he had worked so hard to create, it was being threatened, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending to be just another man in the crowd. Memories of the past. As he sat in the diner, John's mind wandered back to the days when he was in the military. He remembered the tight-knit group of soldiers he had worked with, each one depending on the others to survive. He thought about the missions, the quiet, deadly operations where every move could mean life or death. He remembered the training, the grueling hours of physical and mental preparation that had pushed him to his limits. John had been good at his job, very good. He had proven himself time and time again. He had taken on some of the most dangerous assignments the military could offer and come out unscathed. But all of that had come at a cost. His body had taken a beating, and his mind had carried the weight of the battles he had fought. His military career had ended after a mission gone wrong, something no one had expected. An accident, an explosion. It had changed everything for him. He had returned home, but he couldn't escape the memories, the nightmares, the feeling that he was always on edge, always looking over his shoulder. That was when he had decided to leave it all behind. He had taken the janitor job, kept his head down, and tried to forget. But now, as he sat in the diner, John realized that his past wasn't something he could just bury. It had been waiting for a moment like this to resurface. He had been fired over something so small. An accident, a misunderstanding. But it had triggered something deep inside him. He couldn't let this go. The same discipline, the same training that had made him a successful soldier, it was still inside him. And now, the time had come to use it. As John finished his coffee, he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just the janitor. The world had made a mistake, and he was about to show them just who they had underestimated. He stood up, paid for his coffee, and walked out of the diner. His next move was clear. Back at the office, Mr. Anderson, the CEO, went about his day without giving much thought to John. After all, to him, John was nothing more than the janitor, a man who cleaned the floors, emptied the trash, and did the dirty work. Mr. Anderson was busy making deals and handling important business. He had no time for such trivial matters. He sat in his office, flipping through documents, not noticing the strange tension in the air. The employees, however, seemed to feel it. They had seen John leave earlier, and some of them had noticed how Mr. Anderson had treated him. They whispered among themselves, but no one dared to speak out against the CEO. After all, he was the boss, and who would want to risk their job for something as small as a janitor's fate? But there was something about this situation that felt off. The way Mr. Anderson had fired John so easily made the staff uneasy. They didn't know why, but something about it didn't sit right with them. There was a lingering sense of wrongness, like a shadow that couldn't be ignored. As the day went on, Mr. Anderson continued to dismiss these thoughts. He was confident in his decision. In his mind, John had been lazy, careless, and unprofessional. He was simply one of many employees who had to follow rules or face the consequences. The CEO had no reason to believe there was anything unusual about this situation. To him, it was just another small problem solved. However, what Mr. Anderson didn't know was that his decision was a huge mistake. He didn't realize that he had made an enemy, not just any enemy, but someone who was capable of things he could never imagine. The disbelief among employees. As the hours passed, the employees slowly began to realize what had happened. John was gone, and no one could quite understand why. They had all seen the way Mr. Anderson had treated him. The dismissal had been harsh, unjust, and completely unnecessary. Some employees even began to feel bad for the janitor. He had always been quiet, polite, and reliable. No one had ever seen him cause trouble. A few employees gathered near the break room, talking in hushed voices. "Did you see the way he fired him?" One employee whispered. "That was just cold. John didn't deserve that." "I know. It didn't make sense. He's always been so quiet, always did his work without complaining." Another employee replied, "Maybe Mr. Anderson was having a bad day." But deep down, they all knew that something else was going on. Mr. Anderson had never been the most compassionate leader, but firing someone for something so small, that didn't seem like him. Something felt off, and it wasn't just the employees who were beginning to notice. The CEO's continued confidence. Mr. Anderson remained unaware of the stir he had caused among the staff. He continued to go about his day, making phone calls, signing documents, and preparing for upcoming meetings. He had no reason to think about John any longer. To him, the matter was settled. As the afternoon wore on, Mr. Anderson began preparing for an important business meeting that evening. He reviewed the reports and went over his presentation, focused on getting everything perfect. There was no room for distractions, no room for mistakes. After all, he was the CEO. He didn't need to worry about something as small as a janitor. However, his confidence was about to be shattered. The first hint of trouble. Around 4 p.m., Mr. Anderson's assistant knocked on his office door. "Mr. Anderson, there's a man here to see you. He says it's urgent." Mr. Anderson barely looked up. "Tell him I'm busy. I don't have time for visitors right now." The assistant hesitated, glancing at the man standing in the hallway. "He insists on speaking with you. He says he's here to discuss John." The moment he heard the name, Mr. Anderson's face went pale. "John? What about John?" He stood up quickly, realizing that he had made a huge mistake. The assistant stepped aside, and in walked John. John wasn't wearing his janitor uniform anymore. Instead, he was dressed in a sharp suit, looking every bit the professional. He walked into the room with the calmness of a man who had all the time in the world. His presence was commanding, and Mr. Anderson, who was used to being in control, suddenly felt small. The CEO's realization. "Mr. Anderson," John said, his voice calm and steady. "We need to talk." The CEO froze, unable to speak for a moment. He had fired this man just hours ago. And now here he was, standing before him with an air of confidence that Mr. Anderson had never seen before. "Wah! What is this?" Mr. Anderson stammered, his arrogance fading. "How are you? What is this?" John's eyes narrowed slightly. "You fired me today. But what you don't know, Mr. Anderson, is that I'm not just any janitor. I think it's time you learned who you're really dealing with." John stood across from Mr. Anderson, the CEO, whose face was pale and flushed at the same time. It was clear that Mr. Anderson had no idea what was happening, but John wasn't about to waste time explaining. He had already made his point. Now he needed to get to the heart of the matter. "Mr. Anderson," John said calmly, his voice steady but firm, "I wasn't just some janitor you could fire without a second thought." Mr. Anderson opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He could barely process what was happening. The janitor, no, the man standing in front of him, wasn't the quiet, harmless worker he had believed him to be. There was something different about him now, something that made Mr. Anderson feel uneasy. John leaned in slightly, locking eyes with the CEO. "You see, I've lived a different life than the one you assumed, the life you never bothered to ask about. And today, you made a huge mistake." John paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. He could see the confusion and fear in Mr. Anderson's eyes, but there was no turning back now. It was time for the truth to come out. The shocking truth. "Do you remember the name John Clark?" John asked, his voice low. Mr. Anderson frowned, trying to recall if he had ever heard that name before. "John Clark. Wait, why do you?" But before Mr. Anderson could finish his sentence, John spoke again, this time with more authority. "I'm not just a janitor, Mr. Anderson. I was once a Special Forces operative in the military, a highly trained soldier who served my country on dangerous missions. I did things most people can't even imagine, things that have left a mark on me, physically and mentally. But you wouldn't know that, would you? You didn't even take the time to know who I really am." Mr. Anderson's face turned even whiter as the weight of John's words hit him. He was speechless, staring at the man in front of him, now realizing how wrong he had been. John was not who he had thought he was. This wasn't just a janitor standing before him. This was a man with a past that had prepared him for moments like this one. The danger in underestimating someone. The silence in the room grew thick, and for the first time that day, Mr. Anderson felt truly afraid. He had always prided himself on being the one in control, on being the boss. But now he was no longer sure of anything. John's expression remained unchanged. He wasn't angry. He wasn't vengeful. He simply spoke the truth, something that had been long buried and forgotten. "The thing is, Mr. Anderson," John continued, his voice steady, "I'm not here to seek revenge or cause trouble. I came here to let you know that you shouldn't underestimate people. You never know who they really are or what they've been through. And you definitely shouldn't treat anyone with disrespect, especially when you have no idea who you're dealing with." John took a slow step back, his eyes still locked on Mr. Anderson's. The CEO was still frozen, his mind racing to make sense of everything he was hearing. He had fired a man who was not only capable of far more than cleaning floors, but was also someone who had seen things most people couldn't even imagine. John's calm demeanor and measured words only made the impact more intense. The truth hit hard, and Mr. Anderson had no way to escape it. The realization. John let the silence fill the room for a few seconds, allowing Mr. Anderson to fully process everything. Then he turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he paused and glanced back at the CEO one last time. "Think about it, Mr. Anderson," he said softly. "Remember this moment the next time you decide who is worth your respect." With that, John walked out of the office, leaving a stunned CEO behind. Mr. Anderson stood there for a long moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened. But no matter how hard he tried, he knew one thing for certain. He had made a grave mistake, and it was one he wouldn't be able to forget anytime soon. The next few days at the office were filled with tension. No one could believe what had just happened. The employees had all witnessed the way John had confronted Mr. Anderson, and now they were left in a state of shock. The janitor, no, the Special Forces operative, had left the office, but the story of his surprising revelation had spread like wildfire. Whispers filled the hallways, and everyone talked about what they had seen. Some employees wondered how they had never known about John's past. How had someone so capable been working among them all this time without anyone noticing? And more importantly, how had Mr. Anderson been so blind to the truth? But despite the growing gossip, Mr. Anderson's world had crumbled. His once confident demeanor had completely disappeared. He had spent years building his reputation, but now that reputation was in ruins. The truth about how he treated his employees, and the dangerous mistake he had made by firing John, was out in the open, and it wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. Mr. Anderson's struggle. For the next few days, Mr. Anderson barely showed his face in the office. He spent his time locked away in his private office, making phone calls and trying to salvage his business. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the reality of what had happened. He had fired someone who was far more than just a janitor, and it was a mistake he couldn't undo. He knew that John had made his point clear. It wasn't about the job. It was about respect. Mr. Anderson had failed to see that. He had treated John as if he were insignificant, and now that mistake was haunting him. A meeting with the board. The following week, Mr. Anderson had to face the board of directors. They had been hearing rumors about the incident, and now they demanded an explanation. As Mr. Anderson sat before the board, he could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to speak. He had always been the one in control, the one making decisions, but today was different. He was no longer the confident leader he used to be. Today, he was a man who had made a grave error. I made a mistake," Mr. Anderson finally admitted, his voice faltering. "I fired someone without understanding who they were. I treated John Clark as just another employee when I should have treated him with respect." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't sure how to react. They had always trusted Mr. Anderson, but this incident had shaken their confidence. "We've been hearing some troubling things about John," one board member said carefully. "Are you telling us that he was more than just a janitor?" Mr. Anderson finished the thought for him. "Yes, he was a retired Special Forces operative. I didn't know that. I didn't take the time to find out. And now I have to face the consequences of that mistake." There was a long silence in the room. Mr. Anderson waited for the board to respond, but all he heard was the soft rustling of papers and the tapping of pens against tables. He knew that this wasn't just about the firing anymore. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't undo. The public fallout. As news of John's story spread beyond the office, it quickly became a media sensation. The press had caught wind of the incident, and soon there were headlines everywhere. "CEO fires janitor, but he's actually a retired Special Forces operative." The story was everywhere. Interviews with employees who had witnessed the scene, stories about John's military past, and reactions from people who couldn't believe the way Mr. Anderson had treated him. Social media was flooded with opinions, and the public was quick to criticize the CEO's actions. Soon, people began to question Mr. Anderson's leadership. How could he have been so blind to someone's true worth? Was he so wrapped up in his own power that he couldn't see the potential in his own employees? The media storm only made things worse for the CEO, and he realized that his reputation might never recover. A lesson learned. In the end, Mr. Anderson learned a hard lesson. He had been quick to judge and slow to understand. He had treated someone with disrespect without ever considering their background or what they had experienced in life. John had walked away from the office with his dignity intact. He didn't need to seek revenge or make a public scene. He had said his piece, and that was enough. He knew that sometimes the best way to teach someone a lesson was to let them learn it on their own. As for Mr. Anderson, he would spend the rest of his career trying to repair the damage he had done. He would never forget the moment John had walked into his office, revealing the truth that would change everything. And maybe, just maybe, he would think twice before ever underestimating someone again. Days turned into weeks, and life at the office slowly started to return to a kind of normal. But for Mr. Anderson, nothing would ever be the same. His mind kept replaying the day he had fired John. The regret never left him. He could not shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake, one that might have cost him his credibility and reputation forever. Even though John had moved on and was far from the office drama, the ripple effects of his actions continued to haunt Mr. Anderson. The media hadn't forgotten the story. People still talked about it, especially when it came to the idea of respect and how easily someone could be misjudged. Mr. Anderson tried to put the incident behind him, but every time he went to a meeting or met with someone new, he could see the way they looked at him. There was always a sense of doubt now. He had been so caught up in his world of power, money, and status that he had failed to recognize the strength and experience that lay in people he thought were beneath him. John had quietly walked away, but the lesson he taught was still loud and clear. Mr. Anderson's ego had been his downfall. The realization. One evening, as Mr. Anderson sat in his office long after the workday was over, he looked out at the empty streets below. The lights of the city glistened, but he didn't feel any excitement or satisfaction. He thought about how John must have felt when he was working for him, how he had been looked down upon and dismissed. John had never once complained. He had simply done his job with quiet dignity. Now Mr. Anderson felt the weight of his actions. He had fired a man who had served his country, who had risked his life for others, and he had done it without a second thought. He had allowed his own arrogance and assumptions to cloud his judgment. John had been a reminder that strength comes in many forms, not just in the flashy power suits or loud voices, but in quiet resilience and untold stories. Reaching out. Mr. Anderson knew he had to make amends. He couldn't just let this go. He had learned his lesson the hard way, but maybe, just maybe, he could fix things. One morning, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he had been afraid to call before. The phone rang for a moment before someone answered. "Hello." It was John's voice, calm and steady. "John." Mr. Anderson's voice trembled slightly. "This is Mr. Anderson. I want to apologize for what I did. The way I treated you. It was wrong, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I needed to say it." John paused for a moment. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't rushing to forgive either. He had moved on from the event, but he appreciated that Mr. Anderson was taking responsibility for his actions. "I don't need your apology, Mr. Anderson. I made my peace with everything a long time ago. But I do appreciate you calling." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before John continued. "Just remember that respect is earned, not given, and you've got a long road ahead if you want to rebuild what's been broken." A new beginning. The conversation ended, and Mr. Anderson sat in silence for a moment. He had expected more anger, more bitterness. But instead, he had heard something else. Wisdom. John had made peace with the situation. And even though Mr. Anderson's reputation was forever tarnished, maybe he, too, could find a way to move forward. The lessons learned were hard, but they were necessary. No amount of money or status could make up for the way he had treated others. He understood now that it was the people who made him who he was. The employees, the quiet workers, the ones who didn't demand attention, but who were always there. Those were the people who mattered the most. Living with the consequences. As time went on, Mr. Anderson tried to show more humility. He started taking more time to talk to his employees, to listen to their stories, and to recognize their value. The media never fully let him forget his mistake, but that was something he would have to live with. It was part of his journey now. He could no longer ignore the lessons he had learned, and every day he worked to become a better leader. But he knew one thing for sure. The incident with John would stay with him forever. It had been a turning point in his life. A reminder that sometimes the strongest people were the ones who went unnoticed. It had been a few months since the firing incident, and things had begun to settle down. For Mr. Anderson, however, the events that had unfolded still weighed heavily on his mind. He had tried to move forward, to rebuild his reputation, but he knew that it wasn't going to be easy. The respect he had once taken for granted was now something he had to earn, one step at a time. One day, as he sat in his office, he received an unexpected visitor. The receptionist buzzed through, her voice shaky. "Mr. Anderson, there's someone here to see you. It's John Clark." Mr. Anderson's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen John since that day in the office, and he didn't know what to expect. Was John angry? Did he want to confront him further, or had he come to teach him yet another lesson? "Send him in," Mr. Anderson replied, his voice steady despite the nerves building inside him. As John entered the room, Mr. Anderson stood to greet him. He was surprised at how calm John looked. No anger, no bitterness, just a quiet confidence. "Mr. Anderson," John said, his voice low and firm, "I wanted to come by and tell you something in person." Mr. Anderson motioned for John to sit, his mind racing with questions. "Of course. What is it, John?" John took a seat across from him, his posture relaxed but direct. "I've been following what's been happening with you. I know you've been trying to make things right, and I wanted to say that I respect that. It takes a lot of courage to admit your mistakes and try to do better." Mr. Anderson was taken aback. He had expected some sort of confrontation, not this calm, measured response. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," John continued, "but one thing I've learned is that people are capable of change. And I see you trying to change. That's why I came here today, not to reopen old wounds, but to acknowledge your efforts." For a moment, Mr. Anderson didn't know what to say. He had never expected this kind of forgiveness from John, especially after everything that had happened. It was clear that John had moved on, but he was also offering something more: understanding. "Thank you, John," Mr. Anderson said softly. "Your words mean more than you know. I know I'll never fully make up for what I did, but I'll keep working to be better. I've learned a lot from this, and I'll never forget it." John nodded, standing up to leave. "I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Anderson. I wish you the best." As John left the office, Mr. Anderson sat back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. He had been wrong, but now he was learning from his mistakes, and maybe that was the first step toward becoming the man and the leader he should have been all along.